We just had an anonymous question come in chat that said, what steps should I take for a career in Python as far as classes to take or what to learn, and then what to expect day to day at a company? Fantastic question. I love answering questions like this. If you already know that you want to learn Python, I'm guessing that you've already looked into the kinds of things that you can do with Python that led you to that as a programming language that you wanted to study. Python is a good general purpose kind of language. You can do a lot of things with it. You can do system level programming, a little bit slow for that, but you can do it. Very popular for data science. It can be used for web development. It can be used for things like chatbots. My chatbot is entirely written in Python. So there's a lot of use for Python. It's a very general purpose kind of language. You can do a lot of things with it. That being said, there are some things that Python is going to be better for than others. For example, I mentioned data science, machine learning. There are a lot of really good libraries that have been written by people who have found ways of making some aspects of Python extremely fast for things like crunching a lot of data and doing a lot of what we call data science, data analytics, and reporting on that data. There's also a lot of work around machine learning where you're training models to say, go learn this about this data, and now when I give you some data, you can tell me based on what you've learned what the outcome should be. So a lot of predictive analysis. So there's a lot of very good scientific kind of work coming out of the Python community. Now you can get into system level programming. You can get into just shell scripting type of work where you just want to automate something about your system. Every time you open a terminal, you want to run some code and do something. You can do that sort of thing in Python as well. As far as what classes to take, it will depend a little bit on what you want to do with your career. Do you want to get into data science? Do you want to do web development? Do you want to do some other kind of programming? And what led you to Python in the first place? If you're learning Python, or if you've looked at Python and decided you wanted to learn Python simply because it's an easy programming language to learn, then that's okay too. Because, like I said, Python is a good general purpose language. It's really easy. Shouldn't use the word easy. It's relatively straightforward to learn. The person that designed the language, his name is Guido van Rossum, and Guido basically modeled Python after a programming language called ABC, which was meant to teach kids how to code. So Guido basically built Python with the mindset of this should be easy enough for a child to understand the syntax, to be able to read through it and kind of get a sense of the flow of what this software is trying to do. That was the whole goal of the language. Now it's adapted since then and things have been changed. And the whole purpose of making it an open source language is that people can introduce changes that they would like to see in the software. And so they have this whole process where you can propose a change to Python and say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if the language did this? And you write a little mini white paper about it, explaining the advantages and disadvantages of if Python did this thing, here's how it could impact. Here's some example code of what I would like Python to do. And then basically goes to a whole Python committee and it kind of gets voted on, like, should we adopt this as a change to the language? Now, if it's a breaking change where somebody says, hey, like, I don't want Python to do this anymore, I want it to do this instead, it takes a much longer process, as I understand it, because they don't want to break how Python works. They're happy to add additional features and additional ideas to the language. At the same time, I would say as a language maintainer, I would be less likely to say, oh, I want to take this really popular library and just build it into the language to begin with, so that everybody that downloads Python by default automatically has that capability. They're probably less likely to do that if libraries already exist, especially if there's more than one library that exists that does that thing. Because again, as a language, like as a core language, they want it to be very minimal, to do like a set amount of things. But if you say like, hey, you've never done this data, this type of data structure before, I'd like to introduce that into the language, then you have that flexibility to do that. So there are a lot of really nice things about Python. Now, Python historically has not been a very fast language. There are some things that have been highly optimized, like the math libraries and the data science libraries and scientific libraries and so on. Those all work extremely quickly. And there's been a lot of work around building web-based tooling that will go execute Python code. But it's not extremely fast as a language, but it's getting better. Like Python 3.10, I think is the current version as of today, is much, much faster than previous versions of version 3 of Python, and it's faster than on most version 2 builds of Python. So they are getting better at figuring out how to actually build the interpreter that reads the Python script line by line and figures out how do I make the computer actually do something with this code. So it's not a compiled language like, C, C++, C#, Java, Go, where you actually have to compile it into a binary and then you execute it as often as you like. Python will actually execute it as it interprets that script. Sometimes it'll go through and it'll cache things. So if you run a Python script, sometimes you'll see a resulting file. Instead of .py as a file extension, you'll see .pyc, which is kind of a pre-compiled version of that script. So the interpreter says, oh, hey, that file exists. I've already done this work of interpreting it and actually running it. It'll go run that one instead. It can be very beneficial as far as like speeding it up slightly. The language maintainers are getting much better at building those sorts of speed enhancements into the language. So as a language, Python is actually quite powerful, does a lot of things. As far as what a day-to-day job looks like in Python, that also varies a little bit based on the company. I've worked at companies where we used it for building out APIs. I've used it at companies where we did it more on the DevOps side of things to automate what we do at a systems level. But Python as a language is pretty powerful, but it also depends on what that company does. So I hate to use the overarching, like, it depends kind of language when I answer questions. But in this case, it really does depend. Like, what should I learn about Python? Well, it depends what you want to do. What am I going to do day to day with that language? It depends on the company. So it depends a lot on what you want to do with the language and what kind of company that you want to work at. So as far as directing you to what classes to take, that's going to vary a little bit based on what you want to go do as a developer. And why did you choose Python? Is Python the best language to go learn for that particular kind of thing? If you want to get into web development, is that the best tool? If you want to get into system level development, is that the best tool? It's a good starting point for a lot of things. I think it's good to learn just general like object-oriented programming principles, but it can also be pretty tricky to figure out how do I import different things, especially when you're structuring your code in a particular way. There are things you have to be careful about as far as how you're importing code that, if I build a module that imports another module or another file, that file can't import the original one, because then you end up in a circular reference of importing files. And then Python breaks. It doesn't know how to handle that. Other languages say, oh, I've already required that file. I've already got that code in memory. I don't need to execute it again. Python doesn't have that capability. Every time you say go import that other file, it starts executing that file line by line. And if the first line it sees is like go import this other file, it pauses what it's doing and it goes and imports that file and starts running that file line by line. And so you can get into circular references, which can confuse a lot of people the first time that you're learning Python and you're trying to split files up into multiple files. You can run into problems there. Overall, though, I really like Python. It's the language I use the most, but the answers to your question will depend a lot on what you want to do with Python. I use it for automation. I use it for a lot of home automation, making the lights blink behind me when somebody follows, or a lot of the chatbot stuff that you see happening in chat is all happening because of Python. I do a lot of system level programming where I automate things when I do little clips of answering questions like this. It's clipping all the stuff out and processing that as video. So as soon as I hit a button on my Stream Deck that says I'm done answering this question, Python kicks in and it's doing a bunch of work to go extract that bit of video and prepare it to upload over to YouTube later on, or to the podcast later on. And so I've got all kinds of Python scripts written up that once it's finished, it'll prompt me and say, what was that question about? Like, go write a prompt for it, and it gets ready to prepare everything to upload to YouTube. It'll send everything over to the podcast for the audio podcast. So all of that stuff is done in Python, but it depends on what you want to do with Python. It's a very powerful language. It can do a lot of things.